Okay, here we go. Welcome, and we'll just give a few moments, maybe a minute or so, just for people to come. All right. If you can see and hear, perhaps you could just comment or like, and that way I know. Lovely. Good morning, Stephen, Roberta. Good morning. You can see and hear all right? Good morning, David. All right. Okay, we'll just let people come in. Good morning, Maggie. Just give a little few moments before we go on. We have a. This is one of my favourite stories, actually, that I'm going to be giving you today from this, the Wisdom of the Zen Masters. I find it very heartwarming, and I think very apposite for our time at the moment. It's quite a fractious time. Obviously, we're still living. Good morning, Carolyn. We're still very much living with this idea of lockdown looming, and COVID virus is looming. A lot of political fractiousness, and it's been like this for quite a long time. Hello, Jackie. Um, so I thought this story would be quite good because it's heartwarming, but not just for the sentiment, but also because there are some really useful practical applications for practice generally. And it speaks not only to some of the problems that we are experiencing, but also perhaps what we can do about it as part of our own practice. And that's really important, I think, particularly at this time, because the world is a very big place and we are often left feeling quite powerless in the face of it. You know, there are things that we're disturbed by. And the world has always been a disturbing place. But, you know, the Buddha always took the view that human beings are like the inexhaustible lamp, you know, that if we harbor our and cultivate our own light, then that light lights, you know, touches the hearts of other people, which can help them too. And you know, the reason it's called the inexhaustible lamp is that, you know, one lamp can light 1,000 lamps without diminishing its own light, without diminishing its own power or its own integrity. And that's how it spreads, and it's keeping that light alive. And, you know, in many ways, we have to hand ourselves over to the power of the Dharma. But it's having that faith, that knowing that by doing so, and in doing so, we are doing our bit for, you know, if you like, world peace, in a very practical and real way as well. But it starts from the ground, you know, rather than going from top down. This is really from the ground. It spreads out horizontally rather than vertically, and that's the emphasis we need to adopt. You know, in the face of powerlessness, when we look up, if there's really nothing that we feel that we can do, then the best thing is to just come back to exactly where we are, and in this way begin to cultivate the right relationships with the things and the people around us, and to know and have good faith that that is having a real world impact, both in the present, but also down the timeline as well, in the stream of consciousness as it flows from present into the future. So today's talk it concerns Master Taian. An old gentleman came to ask Master Taian for help. He had been chamberlain at court, but was now retired. His children were grown up and married. Recently his wife had died, and he was desperately lonely. He felt he could no longer cope, and he had come to see the master as his last hope. Master Taian pondered what could be done. To suggest formal sitting meditation was unlikely to help. Sitting in the stiff, formal position through audiences, as the old gentleman had done most of his life, why, he had done enough of this. Should he put him to contemplate nature? Yet, however healing that might be, would he, cultured old gentleman that he was, be able to? Thoroughly at home in the vast poetry collection, would not an appropriate verse rise up in his mind and prevent him from the immediacy of seeing? What could be done for him? Then Master Taian suggested, go back home, and the next time you feel really desperate, then go into your innermost room, shut the doors so that you are all alone and unobserved, and there, without deliberation or thinking of to whom, what for, or why, do 9 full prostrations. Just when you feel really desperate, you can lay yourself down simply, with the trust of a little child, for no reason and expecting nothing, and see what happens. Tears were in the old gentleman's eyes as he thanked him and departed. A couple of months later, the old man came back. My life has changed. Will you take me as your disciple? You look happy these days, says Master Taian. Is there anything else? No, replied he. Thanks to your help, all is well. Then why not apply it? Asked Master Taian. So that's the story. We have it set. I think it was originally set in Japan, and we have an old gentleman who was clearly he was a courtier at in the imperial court at the time, and or he had been spent his whole life there. And in those days, in these sort of old-fashioned days, the emperor would get up and hold audiences from 3 a.m. in the morning all the way through. And that would mean that his courtiers would have to sit what's called seiza. And seiza is, well, for those of you who go to the shobuan or to a dharma center, that's what we call the chanting position. So you are kneeling, you're kneeling on your heels on the floor, and you would sit there with your hands on your thighs like this, in a sort of quite robust posture. And you would just stay still like that for these long meetings. So when Master Taian was contemplating what to suggest for the old man to help him, that's why he rejected sitting meditation, or zazen as it's called, because this old gentleman had probably done more zazen than most Zen roshis and Buddhist monks in the whole of Japan, because he would have spent hours and hours and hours in this, and clearly he had that bodily and mental control and discipline to be able to really sit strongly and with great strength there, which is the foundation of religious practice. But let's sort of scroll back a little bit, because how did this old man end up in the predicament in the first place? What we have, of course, is an old gentleman. It says that he's basically living on his own. The children have grown up, they're married, they've obviously moved out, they have children of their own. He sees them, of course, but children may love their parents, but particularly with small children, they have lives of their own, and so the older parent loses that function, loses their part of their identity. Being a parent of a child is an identity, and once the children have flown the nest, there is a great loneliness that can be experienced. And on top of that, he was now a widower, so his wife had recently died. His companion, who had shared this experience with him, they had bonded through that. She was now gone as well, so he obviously felt her absence, and so now he felt desperately lonely. And this is where I think it comes back and speaks to our current predicament, because when we lose those supports that we have created throughout our lives, quite naturally, those things that we're familiar with, they can be people, they can be habits, situations, even just going to work. I remember very much when I used to work many years ago at the union. There was an older man in the dispatch department who would always turned up to work extremely well dressed, blazer, tie, and everything. The dispatch department was not the usual department you expect people to turn up in a collar and tie, but he always did. He was very old school, quite literally, and he loved his work. He was always there, every day, and then. And then came his retirement, and in a way, he sort of seemed to be looking forward to it. But somebody visited him 6 months later and found that he was really feeling very depressed. He'd opened the door. He was a different man. He'd lost weight. He was unshaven, looking quite dishevelled. But fortunately, this other chap, who was his friend, sort of basically said, "Right, pull yourself together," and sort of got him back on the track again. But these sort of things can happen, and I've certainly heard of those things happening when some people find the transition, say, from work to retirement, they've really been looking forward to it. But then once it stops, they realise that much of their life had been wrapped up in that. And now suddenly there's this absence. They had nothing else, and this is where the spiritual path can come in for a lot of people. Some people then become interested in this latter part quite often of life. They can become, interested because they're looking for that reconnection back with their vitality, if you like, what Joseph Campbell used to call your bliss. The bliss in this case was not just, happiness in a sort of purely personal sense. It was something much deeper in the heart, a spiritual connection, if you like. And so this older man had lost it, and this is why people come to a spiritual practice. And in Buddhism, this is addressed, and of course in Christianity it's addressed as well. This is why in the New Testament there's much talk of love. Love thy neighbor as thyself, and the idea that faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, because love is a connecting force. Christmas Humphreys, the founder of the Buddhist Society, used to say that love was the glue that held the universe together. And the Buddhist equivalent of this, and you may not it may not be apparent when we first come across it, is actually the Sanskrit term samadhi, because samadhi is the term that's often translated into English as oneness. So, when we talk about being absorbed into a meditative state or into a mindful state, or when we talk about giving myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done, which is the heart of the Zen practice, then what we are entering into is this state of samadhi. And samadhi, that term sam means to join together. Samadhi means to join two things together that had become apart, but rightly they belong together. And this is very important, because this is the love. Because it's a unifying force. That's why it's translated as oneness in that way. And it's that connection that the old man had lost. And suffering does that to us. When we suffer from something, and again it's been said before, when we suffer from something, there's a condition of alienation that we feel. When there's because what suffering does is it causes a rupture. It causes a rupture with the flow of our life. So when everything's okay, we can just sort of flow along with things quite naturally. But something happens, a bereavement, we lose our job, we fall ill, is another example. For example, then we experience that rupture, that there's a break there. And the reaction that comes from that can be many. I become angry, I become depressed, I become frustrated or bitter. There can be many different reactions that come. I could become very driven, actually, and go in a quite different direction. But still, it's a sort of compensation for that rupture that's come about. Actually, what we need, the healing action of this, is to come back into connection with that life, with that vitality, and this is where that love and that samadhi really comes in. So this was the position that the old gentleman was finding himself in. And so he goes to see the Master Taian, of course, to ask for some advice. And Master Taian is quite nice because we get his sort of internal thoughts on the problem. This is how, so when people come to him with this problem, what are the things that he immediately thinks of? So the first thing he thinks is that sitting meditation. So why does meditation lead to samadhi? Well, it leads to samadhi because what it does is it takes that one who feels broken and disconnected, which is I, and so to speak, teaches us how to forget him. Because this is how those thoughts, that bundle of thoughts of, I don't feel right, I'm not happy, this makes me angry, the world is unfair, all those sorts of things that cause that feeling of a rupture to actually appear in consciousness. That I, which is at the basis, that I don't like, or I want things to be different to how they are, It allows it to be forgotten. The way it does that is that in a practice of meditation, we have a focus of meditation. Quite often it's the breath, isn't it? We'll be asked to focus on the breath, to give ourselves into the breath as it enters and leaves the body, for example. One of the earliest Buddhist meditations, Anapanasati, was to just focus on the air as it enters and leaves the body at the nostrils. I use it quite often when I'm teaching meditation for people because it's very simple to do, and it allows people to, really experience the sensation of the air entering and leaving the nostrils. We have to really, we have to really give ourselves into that in order to stay with that sensation. And of course, what happens is those I-based thoughts, why am I doing this? Or I'm not doing this properly, or I wish I was better at this, all start crowding in, or I start thinking about, oh, and later on I must go shopping, and what do I need to do? And I construct a shopping list and all that sort of stuff. And we have to learn to recognize that, let go of it, and then come back to that focus, whatever it is. And it could be the air entering and leaving the body. It can be on the out breath. It can be on the sensation of the air coming into the chest and rising and falling. It doesn't really matter. Some people use mantras as well, so they can be just thought as well. We can put a count on the out breath. That's the typical Zazen. We give ourselves into the out breath, and then we put a 1 onto the out breath, and we give ourselves into that, and that's the focus of what we give ourselves to. But in the same way, we can practice meditation in the midst of our activities as well. So when we're doing, well, this, for example, talking or listening to a talk, or tidying up, making dinner, making the beds, filing, whatever it is that we're doing, walking down the street, waiting in a queue at the supermarket, checkout, all those things we can give ourselves into. Those themselves can become the focus of the meditation. And this meditation in activity is what's called daily life practice. It operates within the ethical framework, obviously, of the good behavior and the proper conduct for human beings. Those are our 5 precepts in Buddhism. And and the sitting meditation is just an opportunity to deepen that. And what happens with that is that we become absorbed, and this absorption into the focus of the meditation, into the heart of it, allows me to forget myself, because I cannot put myself down. A thought cannot get rid of a thought, and that is what I am. So instead, what we do is become distracted, and this is a quality of consciousness that we use every day, but we don't recognize just how powerful and how transformative it actually is. So, for example, if we've all had the experience of reading a great book and what we say, losing myself in it. And what that means is that, say we're reading a novel, okay, and we become the story, don't we? I mean, it's a peculiar experience, that samadhi absorption. It's a peculiar experience because, in a sense, I am no longer aware that I'm reading a book. All that I'm aware of is that this story is living. It's sort of living in consciousness. So, there are images that come up internally, perhaps of the, if it's set in Victorian England, perhaps it's a sort of, I don't know, some kind of Sherlock Holmes things or whatever, and we find ourselves on a mystery. And then he's being, Sherlock Holmes or Dr. Watson is being chased down the sort of back alleys of London through the pea super or whatever, and he hears footsteps, and our own heart quickens. Our heart speeds up, and we begin to become nervous. We begin to sort of become excited. Our skin begins, our pores begin to secrete sweat. Our breathing rate changes. It begins to speed up. It's as if I had become Dr. Watson. And that is exactly what consciousness can do. So consciousness can identify itself as Martin Goodson, which it does. When I fall asleep, Martin Goodson isn't there anymore. So what is consciousness then? When Martin Goodson wakes up again, then here he is, because the consciousness has identified himself with the thought of Martin Goodson. And then I pick up a book of that Sherlock Holmes or whatever, and I start reading, and then I become Sherlock Holmes. I become Dr. Watson. I become the various characters in the book. And physiologically, I begin to experience the story, the living story, as I'm actually reading it. And if I'm really absorbed into it, then, the world around me can fade away. This is why, if you're reading on the top of a bus, you can sometimes miss your stop if you're really absorbed into it. Same when we go to the cinema or when we watch Netflix. If it's something we call it immersibility, don't we? So we're familiar with this. And the reason that consciousness can do this is that consciousness itself has no form. It is what's called empty. Its nature is shunyata. And because its nature is empty, it can therefore, like water, pour itself into any container and vivify and animate any form that it touches, that it pours itself into. So when we give ourselves into that object of meditation, then Martin is forgotten. And what happens? That consciousness then reverts back to that formlessness, to that emptiness as well. And this is why it is so powerful. This is so what Master Taian was doing was saying, look, this old gentleman is his consciousness, which is empty, is identifying itself as an old gentleman who has lost his family and who has lost his wife and who identifies himself as a lonely old gentleman. His consciousness isn't a lonely old gentleman. His consciousness itself is empty by nature. So if we can just get him to forget that he's a lonely old gentleman, then that consciousness reverts back to being empty. And when it reverts back to being empty, actually what happens is it reverts back to the here and now, the present moment, and it flows. It flows and reconnects with the life that is always around him. And this is why the second thought that Master Taian has is the thought of contemplation of nature. And this is something that really is important for us too. We can go out. This is something that we can actually go and do, and that is to take a half-hour walk in a leafy place. I mean, obviously, if you live out in the countryside, it's on your doorstep. But even if you live in a city, I mean, I live in London here. We have so many green spaces, and in fact, it's been one of the real joys of this lockdown is taking the A to Z of London out and having a look and looking at all the different parks and green spaces that are around here, and it's been fascinating to really explore them. And something that I really like doing actually is going to such a place and finding something. You begin to look around you, and then what I do, because normally I walk quite quickly. People in London often walk quite quickly because we're always in a hurry to go somewhere. But I deliberately slow the walking down, and I go to quite a sort of slow pace, not a stupidly slow pace, but I really slow it down. So there's a sense of slowing down, and there's a sense of settling in the body. And then all I do is just really give myself into the listening to begin with, and begin to just open up to the sounds. So this now becomes the focus of attention. Martin and what he's doing and what he has to do next gets forgotten a little bit. And I just listen to the world around me. And then I begin to look at the plants and begin to, even to begin with, I'd even just name, oh, there's a dandelion, there's mugwort, there's wild garlic. Oh, what's that one? I don't know. And actually, if I don't know, sometimes I have a little app on my phone that you can sort of take a photograph and it identifies things. And I do that because I'm not doing Zazen anyway. What I'm trying to do is to what I'm trying to do is to take an interest in the world around me. And the fascinating thing is that as you begin to look, you see more. And as you begin to really listen, you hear more. And the more that happens, there's a sort of presence that begins to be felt. It's a little bit, it can become quite powerful actually. It's almost like that experience as if somebody's standing behind you and you suddenly become aware of them and look around like that. Perhaps that sounds a little creepier than I'm sort of trying to express it, but the place itself, the trees have a presence. It's almost if then the breeze blows through them and your heart seems to lift at the same time. And it's quite interesting um, because in Zen, the philosophical and Zen, as you know, is a school of Chinese Buddhism, but its philosophical basis was actually the Huayan school, and in Huayan, they have this notion of the world being truly interconnected and truly interpenetrating, because the apotheosis of samadhi is becoming. So that when we look at the mugwort or when we look at the tree, we become whatever it is that we're looking at. When we hear the bird calling, we become it. So in that way, there is a real closeness that which is the complete antithesis of that loneliness. So try it, experiment a little bit with that. Allow oneself to feel that, because in the Yogacara view, which is also a school that fed into whose ideas and philosophy fed into Zen. In fact, everything around us is consciousness, and things cannot exist outside of consciousness. And what the mind does is it splits itself into two. It splits itself into subject and object. But in fact, both subject and object are part of one and the same mind. And we see this in the bull herding pictures in the verses there, because I think it's in the second picture in the preface, it says. Now he sees that everything is made of the one gold. And that one gold is precisely this, the fact that the world and oneself is not separate or divorced from each other, but is in fact all part of the same mind. The same, what in the good old 60s used to be called cosmic consciousness. I quite like that term. Anyway, it was called, the one mind. And so this is what Master Taian was also contemplating giving him. But unfortunately, the old man was extremely well read, and he knew perfectly well that if he looked at the cherry blossom, he would immediately think of 3 poems to do with the cherry blossom. And even though those poems are beautiful and are about the cherry blossom, they get in the way of that real direct experience of that presence that we've been talking about. And if he looked at the full moon, there would be another 10 poems that would come to his mind. And again, it would cloud consciousness and not allow that conscious, because these are poems that he would remember, and he would then remember learning them at school and how he loved them and how he used to recite them when he was a young man, and perhaps he spoke poetry to his wife, and then he remembered his wife, and then he remembers that he's lost his wife, and then he remembers that he's a lonely old man who's a widower and his children have gone away. So we see how those thoughts interfere and really take us away from that immediacy of the presence of the here and now, and that joy that comes when we experience the living spirit. So finally, he gives him this third option where he suddenly thinks, what we need is this bowing. What we really need is this bowing. Now, why? Well, it's the prostration. So a prostration is literally where you go down on your knees and you place your hands on the floor like this and you touch your forehead to the floor. But I mean, for most of us, it can just be done with the bowing. And this bowing is tremendously powerful. Why? Because the body cuts through to the heart more quickly and more directly than thoughts ever can. In the same way that I can't think my way out of an emotional state, but the body can actually really cut through, and that's because the emotional life arises in the body. It's physiological. It has that as its basis. And so what he got him to do was this act. Now, why does that actually work? It's because it's a ritual act. Why do we perform ritual acts? Why do we light incense and light candles and bow to the cushion, and we sit down in a certain way and we arrange the room in a certain way? It's very ritualistic, and it's deliberately so, because ritual behavior, like ceremony, ritual behavior is consciousness transforming. It itself becomes an agent of change. It can transform the nature of consciousness. And it's really something that has to be experienced. And we all have experienced it. Think about it when you go to a wedding or a funeral, a very formal ceremony. They are quite moving. or they can be very moving. Even though everybody's dressed very awkward, and you're wearing clothes you don't normally wear, and you're in a place that you perhaps don't normally go to if you don't go to church. And there's this situation where two people are getting married, or somebody's being buried or cremated, and it can be hugely moving. Because all these things come together to touch us in a more direct way than even just putting it into words. I mean, verbal descriptions can also be moving, of course. Good writers, that's what they do. But in a way, what a good writer does is that they get to relive the situation that they're describing. So whether you relive it or whether you perform it actually comes down to the same thing. The heart is directly touched in this way. And this is how bowing works. What bowing does, when we lower the head like this, it's saying, in a way, it's abdicating. It's saying, I don't know. It's saying, I need help. It's saying, you are greater than I. It is saying, I'm offering my respect to you. It is saying, this is my sincerity and I give it to you. And somehow in the middle of all that, in that middle of that sort of cluster, something really touches us. And I remember it's elsewhere in this book. There's a saying when Venerable Myokyoni was talking to Master Sesso, her first teacher. He said the most important things cannot be put into words. He says it's like when the true devotee goes to the Shinto shrine. So Shinto is the native animistic religion in Japan. It's a nature religion. Normally what you do, so the shrine will be near a sacred tree or a sacred mountain or in a sacred place. It's very local. The spirits in the kami, as they're called in Shinto, are localized. They're not sort of they're not so much gods in the sort of like in the monotheistic religions. They're very local. So a mountain may be sacred, like Mount Fuji is a sacred mountain, or a waterfall may be sacred. It's considered to be numinous, to have a spirit to that place. This is the presence I was talking about. And so they build a shrine by the side of it. And when you are on pilgrimage or you're walking and you come to a shrine, if you're a devotee, you put a little coin in the box. Like when you go into a church and you light a candle, you put a few pence in, and then only you put the coin in the box. And there's a bell with a rope, and you pull the bell like this, and it goes ding, 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 and that tells the spirit, hey, I've come to pay my respects to you. Please come and show yourself. And there's a little box at the end, an empty box. And that's a space. It's where the kami is supposed to appear. But of course the kami is invisible. It's a spirit. So you can't see it anyway. But in the heart of the true devotee, Master Sesso said, when he bows, he said, something mysterious happens. And he said, what happens in the heart of the true devotee at that moment, that is the blessing that he came for. Really, really profound thing. If we've really, when in the heart of the true devotee, because what is a true devotee? A true devotee is someone who not just believes something blindly, but can open up to it. We can. It's rather like, for example, it's rather like, for example, if you're doing hang gliding. I'd be terrified to do hang gliding. Would I, could I actually do it? Could I actually take that step and jump into that space? I'm not sure that I could. Why? Because I don't have faith in it. But once we've overcome that initial fear, once we do have faith in it, then we can just step out into it, because it's the faith that allows us to take that step into the unknown. And this is what the true devotee can do as well. People can come up and say, oh, it's superstitious nonsense. But for him, it's not. That's not how he's experiencing it. His experience is real. It's as real as every other experience that he has in the waking world. And when he bows there, then his heart opens up. And as soon as the heart opens up, he forgets himself. And what is there is that love. And that is what Master Taian was bringing to that old man. It's a useful thing, because quite naturally in the world, we have our own, little palaces, and we, have our own lives, and we have the people around us. But, things can always change. things, we can lose things, and we can even lose ourselves as well. And if we have nothing to take its place, it can be very terrifying as well as lonely. So to be able to practice this spiritual connection, this being able to open up the heart, just as a matter of practice in our ordinary lives when things are going okay, um, is a tremendously powerful practice, and one that certainly prepares us and can strengthen us for those times when we experience the more frightening and lonely periods in our life. Okay, well, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining me, and we'll have, hopefully, all being well, we'll be back next week. Just the usual reminder, you can go over to the Zen Gateway at www.thezengateway.com. If you want to see more material like this, there's plenty of it there. And you can sign up to our newsletter, and I would encourage you to do so. Just our weekly newsletter, and we just bother you on a weekend just with the latest things we've posted. We don't share your email with anybody else. And if, of course, if you do have any questions or anything like that, we have a Q&A spot that we do. So I take questions and try and provide answers for them once a month. That's called Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice. If you want to send a question in, you can always contact me at the Zen Gateway at gmail.com. The Zen Gateway at gmail.com. All right. So until next time, take care.